Hello, so today we are going to talk about the two basic components of self-esteem. And by separating self-esteem into these two components, we can better understand it in such a way that we can proactively work on our self-esteem. So the two basic components are self-efficacy and self-worth. So what I'll do is I'll briefly describe what each is, and then what deficiency in either one of these causes or both of them, and then what proficiency in both will cause, what healthy self-esteem looks like a little bit. So as far as self-efficacy, when you have self-efficacy, you believe in, one, your competence, so your ability to accomplish tasks, and how well you feel appropriate to situations that you are in. There's a secondary element of this. This isn't just arrogance and ability to think you can do anything. It's the belief in your ability to acquire competence and to grow. So the central element is like really growth. So whenever you're in a situation, either you believe A, you can handle it, or B, you can find a way to handle it. And that's basically what self-efficacy is. Another component of that is your ability to tolerate ambiguity. Or unfamiliar situations, and just trust that in the future you're going to find a way to handle it. So if you are constantly dreading or worrying about stuff, it may be because you believe that you lack the ability to handle it, or handle uncertainty, because you don't believe in your general efficacy. Right? If you don't have a map of how to handle a situation very explicitly, you freak out. It may be low self-efficacy. Okay. Self-worth is your belief that you are worthy of happiness or your desires, or that achieving happiness or your desires is something that is appropriate to you. And then a secondary element of this is that you're allowed to, the belief that you are allowed to direct your own life, right? So that you're not feeling the need to live for someone else or by someone else's standards. Okay? And so when you combine these two, you will get elements where you are pursuing what you are interested in or what makes you happy, and you have belief that either you are competent in those pursuits or you can acquire competence. You feel appropriate to life, right? And another element that's going to go along with this is both having integrity and being centered. So it's harder to bother you if you believe you're competent. It's hard to bother you on the basis that you're incompetent, right? Or if you aren't competent, generally speaking, when someone's not competent, it's because they don't have past experience. So mocking someone for being incompetent when they don't have past experience, it's if they understand that it's just a lack of experience, it won't really make them feel bad. And then secondly, you're more centered in your desires, and you're not pulled off course by other people's, let's say, manipulation of you. Although that's manipulation might not be the right word, because a lot of times people will rope you into stuff that doesn't have to do with your happiness or your desires, not on a conscious level, just through their behavior. And so saying manipulation implies something a little bit more insidious than appropriate. So now we're going to talk about briefly what happens when you don't have either one of these, or when you have one without the other. Actually, let's talk about when you don't have either one. When you don't have either one, what you get is a sort of withdrawal from life entirely, or sort of pulling your hand out of the sock puppet that is your life. Because if what you do doesn't matter, it's very easy to become depressed and feel hopeless, right? And then lack of self-efficacy. And then if you don't think that you're worth anything, then there's not much motivation. So you both pull the motivation. You both feel demotivated and helpless, right? And then you engage in self-sabotage. So even if you very well easily could have gotten what you wanted, both in terms of competency and your ability to direct your life in terms of what's worth. You'll self-sabotage if you don't have both of these things. So if you have efficacy without self-worth, you are more likely to engage in, by any means necessary, sort of actions. So you're more likely to lie, cheat, steal, what have you, in order to get what you're worth, right? Because it creates this sort of sense of entitlement that is one that is not built on bedrock of responsibility. So when you have high self-esteem, you feel responsible for your own life because you are competent, or you feel competent, and so you do what you need to do in order to get what you want in terms of making changes in your life, and not necessarily, hurting other people in the process. You do it in a way that is congruent with your values. If you don't believe in your efficacy, but you still feel that it's inappropriate, that you're not getting your wants and your desires, you will be more likely to violate your own values in order to achieve what you want. Obviously, some people don't place much value on like not lying, not cheating, and not stealing. And for those people, it's a different value set. So you have to think about it differently. But if you value not doing those things, which most people don't most people do, because for most people, a sense of fairness is important to them, it's relevant. Another thing is you're more likely to sit on past success and become complacent if you don't believe in your efficacy, because there's not much incentive to push forward. So this living in the past type of thing, be like, oh, I did this a long time ago, so I deserve XYZ. Oh, I helped you out in that one way. Like, I helped you move 7 years ago, like, come on, help me out. This appeal to past events will be more common when you don't think you can push forward in the future, when you don't have a feeling of self-efficacy. And another is and I mentioned this a little bit, but externalizing things. So when you don't believe in your own self-efficacy, you will not take responsibility for your own life, and instead you'll project it out. And so what this means is blaming others, blaming the situation, whatever it is, because if you don't think that you can do anything to change it, then you can't blame yourself, right? So you blame others. And so overall, this type of attitude in the long run is kind of, this model of self-efficacy, self-worth, has a lot of overlap with some other things. So Carol Dweck's mindset, growth versus fixed mindset, where when you have growth, you think you can change things, and when you think it's fixed, you think it's just innate talent. That layers quite well with this self-efficacy understanding, where when you have a feeling of self-efficacy, it's like having a growth mindset, and when we don't have it, it's kind of like having a fixed mindset. Read that one recently. It's quite a good book, Mindset, Carol Dweck. So let's talk about what happens when you are deficient in self-worth, but you have self-efficacy. One, you're going to be more willing to let others run you over and use and abuse you because it feels appropriate. And so you'll end up kind of playing the supporting character for other people's stories, in a sense, if you want to use that metaphor. And this is, it has some obvious problems, right? Because you're not progressing towards what you want. Which leads me to the second point, which is you won't be willing to step up and take what you want when you have the competence for it, because you don't feel that you're worth it. And so this lack of action, this refraining from action or movement towards what you want, is one of the hardest to notice aspects of self-sabotage, right? Because it's easy to see when you're self-sabotaging by engaging in an action that's just hurting yourself, right? it's a lot harder to see when you're self-sabotaging in little ways that by refraining from action. So, especially if it's, bad habits like eating a bunch of junk food, for example, or, not staying hydrated is like a weird way to self-sabotage, you know. But if you have a high self-worth, you are less likely to engage in these sort of little sabotages and instead, take responsibility for your life, both in terms of the direction, which has to do with self-worth, and efficacy, which is, you got to be the one to do it. The third thing that I have written down is imposter syndrome. I think that overlaps quite strongly with people who have low self-worth are more likely to, even when they're demonstrating the competency for getting what they want, right? They're clearly demonstrating, they have the evidence of having the efficacy for it, but they'll still feel that like they're just a fraud, right? And that they somehow don't deserve it, even though they are engaging in actions required to get there. And so it's this, it's this lack of self-worth that causes the imposter syndrome. So the thing that needs to be sort of thought about moving forward is, so that's self-worth, is how do we sort of try and approach both self-efficacy and self-worth and try and promote them positively. And I think this is a discussion for another time, but it is by breaking these down into these two components, self-worth, self-efficacy, it can help conceptualize something that is perhaps a little less vague than just self-esteem by itself, right? So, because a lot of people really think that they can accomplish a ton of tasks, but they don't feel like they have low self-esteem. Or, sorry, they don't feel like they have high self-esteem. And it's like, well, that's because you're missing out on the self-worth. And a lot of people have high self-worth, and then they think that life's unfair and that they're getting the short end of stuff. And what they're lacking is self-efficacy, the belief that they have control over their life, or, sort of an ability to take responsibility for what they do have control over. And so when you think of it in terms of these two components, it can be easier to identify when something is going wrong and where it could be going wrong in terms of self-esteem. Now, these aren't the only two ways to break up self-esteem, but this is my favorite way of breaking self-esteem up into two components, or just, into the most basic parts. This idea is not entirely, or it's not my own. I've used my own examples, but it comes from, as far as I can tell, Nathaniel Branden, who has written several books on the subject. In particular, I like the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by him. So, as far as discussion goes, is there a time that you have observed someone having self-worth but not self-efficacy, or self-efficacy but not self-worth? Even if that person's yourself, feel free to share. And what was that like? And what do you think might be some solutions to being deficient in either one of these? All right. Have a good one.